Tonight's speaker, Rosemary Gladstar, has been practicing, living, learning, teaching, and writing about herbs, the English pronunciation, herbs, for over 40 years. She is the author of 10 books, including the recently published Medicinal Herbs, A Beginner's Guide, Herbal Healing for Women, Gladstar Herbal Recipes for Vibrant Well-Being, and The Science and Art of Herbalism, an extensive home study course. She is the founder, director of Sage Mountain Herbal Retreat Center and Botanical Sanctuary, founding president of United Plant Savers, and director of the International Herb Symposium and the New England Women's Herbal Conference. She is also the co-founder of Traditional Medicinal Tea Company. Along with creating community and loving people, herbs are her passion and joy in life. Rosemary lives and works from her home, Sage Mountain Herbal Retreat Center, a 500-acre botanical preserve in central Vermont. Please join me in welcoming Rosemary Gladstar.
Thanks, Frankie. What a wonderful voice and a nice way to be introduced. Thank you so much. Yeah, and thanks for coming out on this cold night. I was sort of like Frankie, thinking, who's going to show up when it's so freezing cold? Because I'm also not originally from Vermont, though I've lived here for about 28 years. So I was thinking how privileged I feel and honored to be invited to speak about a subject that's actually illegal to practice in the United States. I get invited all over the country, and I just think that's wonderful because I get to kind of do this silent revolution, which I've been doing for about 45 years now. Most people in this country aren't aware that it is illegal to practice herbal medicine. That's odd because herbal medicine is still in the world the most widely practiced system of healing. World Health Organization estimates that over 82% of the world's population still uses herbs as their primary system of herbal medicine. A lot of times people think, well, that must mean third world or developing countries, but in truth, herbs are still a major system in European countries, in Germany, in France, in Switzerland. They all have very sophisticated systems of healing. China and Japan still integrates and uses herbal medicine. So it's just interesting that we're one of the very, very few countries in the world where herbalism is illegal to practice today. And I know most people don't recognize that. It's also still considered to be the most, not only the most universal system, but the oldest system of healing on the planet. I think if anything predates herbalism, it might be just love and hands, you know. I think those were probably used before people picked up plants and put them on people. They were probably maybe doing an old form of massage or just, you know, that energetic healing with the heart. But in our history of medicine, herbalism is actually recognized as the oldest system in the world. We have record of over 5,000 years of written history, herb books that were written 5,000 years ago and are still published today, actually. And interestingly enough, a lot of that information is still applicable. There's a lot of things about herbalism that has changed, a lot of new information, but a lot of the foundation and the fundamentals of herbalism is empirical, which means that people have tested it and tried it on human beings, not laboratory rats or inhumane testing on animals, but actually on human beings throughout centuries of time. And the best of what herbalism is has been distilled and is passed down for us to use now. It's pretty remarkable. Yeah, it's also the safest system of healing. I know a lot of people in this country, that's one of the issues, like, is it safe? Can I use it? Am I going to kill somebody, myself, you know? But the truth of the matter is, actually, there are herbs that are toxic. There's herbs that are really potent, but those aren't legal for us. They were removed from commerce a long time ago, again, because people have been using this medicine for so long. If you were to use a toxic herb, you would have to work really hard to get it. You would have to really want to get that herb and do something nasty with it or something, you know. So what you have available to you are safe herbs. And actually, in fact, the system of herbal healing is very safe as well. The American Association of Poison Control, the center of it, the one that represents the United States, their latest statistics are that death from legally prescribed and legally used prescription drugs, there's over 100,000 deaths. It's actually over 100,000 deaths a year, putting it at the 4th leading cause of death in the United States. But that very same association gets so few reports of toxicity from plants, they don't have a special category for it. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, and it doesn't mean that people don't get reactions. You can get reactions to chamomile. Some people are allergic to chamomile, they get a rash. You can get reactions to echinacea, but they're idiosyncratic. So the safety measures of herbalism is very large. I always find it so interesting that people will go into a drugstore and buy things on the shelf that actually come with pages, like little booklets, that you have to put really huge magnifying glasses on to read about the toxic side effects of them. Or even like those big ads that are allowed to be taken out and put in magazines now. Like they're 1 page of the drug and 5 pages of the toxic side effects. We can't sell those herbs. You know, herbs that have those kinds of toxicities, thankfully, are not legally available. Doesn't mean we can't get them, but as I said, you have to work hard to get those. So you have a really big safety record, and even more importantly than that is the herbs that we use, we've been using for centuries. So as I said, there's a lot of information. There's not only empirical information and empirical science, which I put a lot of weight in. Empirical science is science that has been tested on human beings. Again, large test studies. You know, we've used these plants. They're deemed safe. So we have incredible amounts of empirical evidence, but we also have a lot of scientific evidence now. There's lots and lots of scientific research done on plants. So for those of us who like that science, or if you really enjoy it, there's a lot of science to verify the safety. So we do have a really big safety net on using the plant. So it's widely available, it's the oldest system, it's safe. Oh, another really great thing about herbalism is that it's ecologically sound. You know, and I think that's important when we're talking about health and healing, the choices that we make for the medicine that we use. It's nice to know that it's safe, that we can use it, and it has, at most, if it's having a side effect, usually the side effect is good. It's doing something good for us, not nothing bad. It's just nice to know that. It's also nice to know that it generally is healing us without doing a lot of bad things in the body. But it's also really good to know that we're making choices that not only are sound for us, but sound for the environment, especially when you're thinking about things like healing. So, so herbalism, like, you know, you can dump the residual of your teas out or your tinctures out or the leftover herbs that you're chopping up or put them back in the garden. You know, there really is very little toxicity in using herbal medicine. And another great thing about it is that it integrates so well with all of our modern systems, including our modern conventional medicine and homeopathy and massage and, you know, even therapy. You know, it's just beautifully integrative. So we have a wonderful system, and that's why I get excited when I come out on a cold night and see people who want to listen to herbalism, and especially a talk on the history. I am going to meander back a little bit, and we're going to look at sort of the historical significance of herbalism in North America. What I'd like to do is spend a little time looking back and a lot of time looking forward, because I think the most exciting thing is that people are interested in herbs again. And do you realize that's fairly recent? It's only really been about the last 45 years that people in our country have been interested again in herbs. When herbalism went underground, it went deeply underground. And people stopped trusting it, stopped using it. It's considered antiquated, kind of quaint, you know, didn't work. People have been using it for thousands of years for mild and serious problems, but it didn't work anymore, so might as well toss it out the door, along with organic food and, you know, all of the wonderful crafts that people did. Just get rid of them because somehow they weren't effective anymore, if you're following what I'm saying. So herbalism was one of those things that just went deeply underground. I always think about it, really, plants thrive underground. It's not a bad thing. The plants grew, the communities of plants grew. We didn't harvest a lot of them. So in a way, it was a saving grace for maybe not American herbalism, but certainly for our plants, our native species. Yeah. But, you know, about 40 years ago, there was a resurgence of interest. I remember when I first started teaching, really literally 45 years ago, I was like in my very early 20s when I first started teaching my first classes and opened my first herb store in Sonoma County, the little town that I grew up, which is still there, by the way. Rosemary's Garden. It's on the main street of Sebastopol if you're ever traveling through. And really, if I taught a class and 3 people showed up, it was like, oh, great, you know, we're going to start a revolution. We're going to change healthcare. And I think we have done a really good job. So what drove herbalism underground and what made it illegal? Let's just do a little trip back in time. When Christopher Columbus arrived here on the North American continent, there was already a tremendous number of herbal systems being practiced on the North American continent. I actually want to say that I think we had some of the most highly evolved systems of healing in the world were being practiced here. We have only remnants of the native traditions. We don't have a lot of information left because shortly after the colonists first arrived, there was a beautiful exchange when they first came, by the way. We can almost say that the lives of those early colonists hung on what they received from those the early native peoples here. The foods and the medicines really helped them through those first years. And much of what our early Western herbalism evolved from embraced those early teachings. But shortly after, you know, only a few years went by, the native peoples weren't so willing to share because they were being killed off by the colonists. And so there's not generally such a willingness to share your knowledge with the invaders. So, but when they first arrived, there were very healthy people by all accounts. The tribal people here, when you look back at the early documentation, they were considered savages, but they were described as being unbelievable specimens of human beings as far as health and well-being and knowledge of the native medicines. So and this is something that that we don't really recognize, but some of the most powerful medicines that are traded on the world market and that are used in world medicine, both conventionally and herbally, are grown on the North American continent. And so the pharmacy here was rich. It was potent and powerful. So some of these herbs, so those of you into plants, some of these herbs will ring bells for you. But herbs like black cohosh, echinacea, the cramp barks of viburnums, the black haw, which grows a little south, sassafras, bloodroot, the sanguinaria, canadensis, you know, there was just this huge, and golden seal, hydrast, and the lady slippers. I mean, these plants were incredible medicines, and they were used by the native peoples in very, very powerful ways. Also, another thing about the native traditions, they had very evolved shamanic techniques. The shamans were like our doctors. They were magicians in what they could do with people. And a lot of people are, you know, they hear these about the shamanic practices and they, you know, they kind of go, oh yeah, you know, kind of old techniques. But I was fortunate, especially in my early years when I was first learning to work with some very powerful native shamans in this country and in South America and in Mexico. And I got to really see what these people were capable of doing. You know, where they would do what we call plant-spirit communication, actually work with the spirit of the plants. Sometimes they would imbibe plant-spirit medicine, this very strong medicine that helped them journey into people's bodies. And those things were real, by the way. They're lost today, you know, pretty much. I mean, I shouldn't say they're really lost, but they're not part of our concept of healing. But there are very, very powerful shamanic healers still. It's rare, but they're still there. You know, just as a little example of their power, I saw this with my own eyes, so I can attest to what I know is true, but there was an elder shaman named Don Jose Matsua who lived in Mexico in the mountains above Guadalajara. And when I first met him, he was over 100 years old. He lived to be 110, and he was extremely well known throughout all of Central and North America and Mexico. And people would travel from all over the world to his little village and, you know, be healed by him. But he used to come up. I had a little herb school in California that also is still there, by the way, called the California School of Herbal Studies. And Don Jose would travel up with one of his assistants, and he would do ceremonies and teachings and also healings. And so one day he was sitting back at the pond, and people would come out, and it would all have to be translated because he didn't speak English. And there was a woman who I knew, a woman named Lorene Boyle, and I'd known her for years, and she was married and hadn't had children in a number of years, and they really wanted children. So she comes and she tells him what she wants. I'd love to have children. My husband and I really want a family. And it was all translated, and he kind of was listening, as the translator says. And he looks at her, and he says some Mexican words, some Spanish words, excuse me. And it's translated as, "Are you sure you know what you're asking for?" I thought that was a very wise man. And she said, yes, 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 I really want children. So he takes his herbs. He doesn't make medicine. He doesn't give them internally. You know, he's not making a prescription. He just starts singing and chanting and, you know, waving his little calling on God to come work through him. And I saw Lorraine about 7 months later, and she was very pregnant. Nothing fishy happened back by the pond, I know. I watched the whole thing. And she has 3 children now, you know. So that kind of healing was, I'm only mentioning that because that was how the people worked here. They knew those plants. They worked with those plants from the time they were small children. They developed these very, very deep relationships with them. They were artists in how they worked with them. And they believed that God, this great spirit, lived in those plants. And so they would talk to that spirit, God, through those plants, and it was very powerful. So that's what the colonists encountered when they came here, and they learned a lot about the medicines, because in our herb books and the textbooks that we have from that time, there's this wonderful information that was not only from Western and Eastern Europe, but also was from the North American continent. And so there was a lively exchange in the beginning, and then, as I said, a lot of that early tradition was lost. There are remnants of it. It's very tragic for us not to have that information, but there are remnants of it. And for a lot of modern herbalists, how we get to those remnants is through the plants themselves. It's not in history books. You have to work with the plants, and you begin to understand how these plants are rooted in their medicine, really. And so what happened for the first 100, 200 years, herbalism was the primary system of healing. There were very, very few doctors in this country, but there were a lot of granny healers, there were a lot of herbalists, there was some interaction with the native people and the shamans, and there was common sense. People just used herbs. So for every one of you who have a history in this country, you can count that you had a grandmother or a grandfather who was a plant person. It's just normal because that's what people did. My grandmother was an herbalist, but she was an herbalist in the way that our grandparents were. She just used herbs. She was from Armenia, and she was a very well-known herbalist. She was actually my first teacher, and a very powerful woman. But so there was this very lively use of plants, and there was an emergence of modern medicine as we know it during this time. Around the early 1800s, there was a couple of very strong medicine fields that started to grow up. One was called the Thomsonian system of healing. If you studied medicine at all, you'll know about that. We still have some remnants of Thomsonian healers, and it was really swept this country. Like, you could take a class. He was a farmer, actually, who lived in New Hampshire, and he just, he abhorred the medical profession and really felt everybody should be able to heal themselves. And he developed a very powerful relationship with the plants and healing, and started these schools, and anybody could go through the schools, and you could all get your MD and call yourself a doctor and go around treating people. And that was good and bad. That, kind of, so you can imagine what that kind of did. I mean, that could be really good, but actually there was no restraints to that. And because of that, and there was also, I want to mention this too, because there was another very powerful system of healing that was evolving at that time called the eclectics. And the eclectics were a medical profession actually that thrived until around the 1940s. So from around the mid-1800s to the 1940s. The last eclectic school in the United States closed in the 1940s. And the eclectic doctors, I want to mention them because I think they were some of the finest examples of healing, because they used modern medicine as it was developing. They used herbal medicine. They used whatever was helpful to people. And so they used this very eclectic system of healing. And they were very popular up until the end of the 1800s. So what happened in this kind of soup of all these herbalists and doctors coming up and everything was, it happened around 1840, a group of medical doctors were called together by a doctor up in New York State. His name was Dr. Nathan Smith Davies. And so he called all the different schools, and there were like 40 different medical schools that came together, and 28 societies of medicine. So that just shows you how eclectic all this healing was that was going on. And they wanted to set a higher standard. They wanted to set the standard which was probably a good thing, and so that when you did graduate from a school, there would be some standard, and a high standard that would be set, so that when you got your license, it really meant something. And all that's really good. I actually have to say that these were probably fairly brilliant. But what happened in doing that, they gained a lot of power, and they decided that all the other systems that had been practiced for, you know, some of them for hundreds of years, should be outlawed. And so that's what happened in the in the 1840s. And it was, they called themselves the American Medical Association. They're very powerful. And within about 30 or 40 or 50 years, they began to close out all the other schools. As I said, the last eclectic school, they hung out the longest. They closed in the 1940s. Herbalism was made illegal to practice. In fact, the laws were written, the government and state laws were starting to take form at that time, and they were written in a way that only licensed practitioners, and licensed practitioners, we all think this is normal, by the way. I mean, nobody thinks anything about this, but it's kind of odd, so I just want to show you why it's odd. So the laws were written that only licensed practitioners that were approved by the state or the government could practice medicine. And if you practice medicine, you could only practice by one standard. So if you were a doctor or a nurse and you'd said, I want to try aromatherapy or herbs in the hospital or sick people, you couldn't do that because it wasn't part of your professional practice. And so all the other systems became illegal at that time. And effectively, herbalism was driven out completely. We're one of 2 countries, maybe 3 countries in the world, where it's illegal to practice the oldest, safest system of healing, even as a home medicine practice, actually. I mean, you're never going to get called on it at home. And the laws were written in such a way that even if your neighbor was going to come and help you, you know, if you're not a licensed practitioner, it's not legal. Of course, they never go that far, but that's how the laws are written. And it basically took medicine and it put it in the hands of police power. So that's why, as an herbalist, if I practice medicine, which I do, without a license, which I do because I can't get a license, that if the police ever did want to come and arrest me, they absolutely could. It would be the police knocking at my door. That should seem weird to all of you, actually. You know, because why that should seem weird to you? This is the problem with Americans. We don't think it's weird because we've been raised in this way. Because health choices are like religious choices. It should be up to you to decide what you want to do, right? So I want to just read something to you that's really interesting. That was a quick history of American herbalism. Isn't that great? I'm going to read you something that was written by the 3rd president of the United States. Who was that? Little history lesson. Jefferson. Yeah, Jefferson, great. He said, if people let government decide what foods they eat and what medicines they take, their bodies will soon be in a sorry estate, as are the souls of those who live under tyranny. He wrote that when he was president of the United States. Benjamin Rush, who is he? Benjamin Rush? Pardon? He signed the Declaration of Independence, and he was a medical doctor. He says, so I can read this well, I'm going to put my glasses on. He says, unless we put medical freedom into the Constitution, the time will come when medicine will organize into an underground dictatorship. To restrict the art of healing to one class of men and deny equal privileges to others will constitute the Bastille of medical science. All such laws are un-American and despotic and have no place in a republic. The Constitution of this republic should make special privilege for medical freedom as well as religious freedom. Oh, but anyway, I just wanted to just point that out to you because I think it is a very important part of our history. So now I'm going to share with you, it hasn't stopped us at all, has it? No, not at all. So what happened is that after World War II, a lot of things like organic food, real food, whole foods, some of the natural crafts, definitely herbalism were kind of driven out. And there was a revolution that was happening at that time. It's called the Age of Chemicals. And we were promised that through chemicals, that modern chemicals, you know, cleaning chemicals, all those chemicals, that we would have no more illness on the planet. And I always say, God, I wish that had worked. It'd be so easy to just take a pill, you know. Take a pill for this, take a pill for that, little tiny things. You don't have to taste them. You don't have to do anything except buy them. And there you are. You'd be healthy forever, you know. But it just didn't work. And it took us quite a while to figure that out. Modern medicine is amazing and miraculous. And it does have amazing life-saving properties, and it does wonders. But it's not the sole medicine. That's the point, you know, and certainly not the sole medicine for all the thousands of home health situations that we have. Those are the places where herbalism can impact us so much. So we were actually convinced as a nation that herbs were antiquated and didn't really have a place anymore. And then around the 1960s happened, and just kind of, it was an organic movement actually. Just who knows what happened? You know, I think the planets were aligned right. I just think there was something going on, you know, like sprouts rising up from under the ground. There were wild weeds coming in. In any case, there was a group of people who just began to want to grow natural foods. They started organic food movements. There were people who wanted to go back to using plant medicine. We didn't really even know what we were doing. You know, we just opened up herb stores. We started making little products. We started talking to people about plants. We started holding conferences. That was really how it happened. It was a small but impassioned movement. And as I said, you know, we were seeded through the country. You know, I was in the West Coast. There were people in the East Coast. There wasn't a whole lot in the Midwest, but slowly the coast came together and the Midwest became ripe. And so from the 1960s, I just want to share with you how things have changed in this country. In the 1960s, if you wanted to find an herb store, it would be very rare. Maybe in New York City, well, maybe in Burlington, but I don't think so. You know, and there was one in San Francisco. In all of California, there was one in San Francisco, and there might have been one in New York, but you definitely could not find herb stores often. You couldn't go into an herb store. You couldn't go into a store and find herbal products. You can go into your grocery stores now and find herb pills and sometimes tinctures. You know, they're just when Robert, my husband, and I were driving here today, we stopped over in Waitsfield at just a little deli on the side of the road, and I was thirsty, and I went in to get something to drink, and they had fresh orange juice, the machine that made fresh orange juice. It was quite exciting. And then I looked over in the juice section, and they had elderberry syrup made by my friend for sale in a regular little deli on the side of the road. I mean, yow, that's amazing, right? Yeah. And so, you know, so products started being made, you know, and then also herb schools. So back in the I opened my herb store, I told you that was in 1972. And then I started a little herb school. It's the longest running herb school in the United States. I opened it in, like, I think it was 1984. You know, and really, I have to say, I was so young. I really knew very little, you know, but I was impassioned by it, and I wanted to do something. I didn't even know what it was, you know, but I wanted to learn, so I figured I'd start a school and bring teachers and study with them. That's what I did, and then other schools started opening up all across the country. We have, you know how many herb schools we have in Vermont? And really good ones. We have one of the most widely recognized herb schools actually in Montpelier, the Vermont Center for Integrative Herbalism. It's a 3-year program with a clinic, you know, a clinic that trains people to do illegal things. So we are seeing a wonderful resurgence. And so why is that so important to us, you know, when we have a great system, you know, our modern medicine? Because the thing about herbalism, I mentioned this, is that it's wonderful for the home. And this is something I want to share with us a little bit, is how do we bring herbs into our home? And how do we use plants? And which herb plants do we use? And so, but I just want to share with you that for all of those home health things, like you get a cold, you get a sore throat, you get a headache, you get a little digestive stuff, this is a place where herbs are so empowering. You can go down to your kitchen if you have garlic, and you open up your kitchen counter, and there's all your wonderful medicinal plants, cinnamon and oregano and thyme and basil. Those herbs are in your kitchen cabinet because they are potent medicines. We've forgotten that because we just associate them with certain food. Basil with tomatoes. Why do you think basil was used with tomatoes? If you eat basil by itself, it's good, but it's not like, oh, this is so great. I mean, it's an acquired flavor. You know, you can hardly think, especially if you're Italian, of eating tomatoes without basil, because basil, the essential oils and the chemicals in it aid in the digestion of acids that are in tomatoes. So it's a perfect complement. And why do you think cloves were used in meat? Because they're preservatives. And why was fennel and all of the whole umbelliferae family used in all those hot, spicy foods and Indian foods? Because they are good for flatulence or gas, bubbles coming out. Boop, boop, boop. they're really good for that, you know. So, you know, that's why we use those. And so, like, you know, if I'm at somebody's home and they're really sick and I know they're not going to have an apothecary, which they should, wouldn't that be fun to have an apothecary in every American household these days? But I know that I can always open up their kitchen cabinet, and if I find oregano and basil and thyme, I'm going to know what to do. You know, I can help heal them with those plants or help them heal themselves. So it's just a wonderful, and as I said, it can be incredibly cost-effective too. Did I mention that? So one of the things I wanted to mention about history that I didn't is when the colonists arrived here, we talked about there was an amazing pharmacy here. Some of the world's most prized medicines grow only in the North American continent. So we have to be responsible caretakers of these plants here. But also, that when the colonists came and they were leaving their homelands forever, they were leaving places where for generations and generations they had been rooted and planted. They would never see their families again. I mean, I think about that. When you travel and leave, you're always going to pretty much see your family if you want, you know. But they were leaving everything, and they usually would come with a steamer truck, those old steamer trunks. So everything of value, their clothing, their blankets, their quilts, everything of value went in there. And a prize that always went was seeds. So what I want to point out to you is many of the plants that you think of as tenacious weeds were the most valuable plants. People tucked those seeds into their chests and brought those with them. So the plants that we are out there digging frantically to get out of our gardens were carefully brought over because of their edible and medicinal properties, and because they had a tenacity, they would grow. So some of our most valuable plants are weedy species like dandelion, considered one of the most valuable medicines in the world. If you were to do a survey, you know, in all of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean, North America, and many other temperate places in the world, and you were to do a survey among among people who use plants as medicine, and you were to say, what are your top 10 favorite herbs, the most valuable? Almost always, dandelion is going to be one of those top ones. By the way, I do want to tell you this. I've traveled so much in the world, and never in any place have I ever traveled have I seen dandelion growing the way it does here. You know, it is the most beautiful, beautiful display in the, when is it, late May, early June, when the fields and fields are covered with those little gold flowers. And yet in the United States, again, we're one of the only places in the world that does this. It's illegal in some communities to grow dandelion in your lawn. You know, it's like they have those laws that if you grow them, you're a bad neighbor, and somebody shows up on your door and says, you have to dig your dandelion. Isn't that insane? Yeah. So dandelion and burdock. The burdock is another one, and the burdock root and the leaves and the flowers, and chickweed and cleavers. We had native varieties, but these plants were also brought. Nettle, we had nettle growing here, but nettle was a very, very, very important plant to the early settlers as a medicine and food. It's one of my, actually probably my top #1 favorite medicinal plant and edible plant. Yeah. Do you all eat it in the spring? It's so good. You know, go out and harvest your fresh nettle tops, steam them, add a little olive oil and lemon and a little feta. Just steam them well so you don't get stung by them. It's really good. Or nettle spanakopita, or nettle in your omelets. Do you know in the Greek and Roman days, they grew more nettle than any other crop? Thousands of acres of nettle in both the Greek and the Roman civilizations, because they use it as food and as medicine and also as fiber. It's a really good fiber. So how do we bring herbs into our life? Like if you were not familiar and you say, you know, I remember some of my grandmother's tales. I'd like to have a few plants. So where do I start? I always like to say, you know, if you could start with 10 basic herbs that are safe, that have a big safety net on each side. If you have reactions to them, it's because it's very idiosyncratic, like chamomile, I mentioned that. Some people can get itchy skin or itchy eyes with it, but mostly it's considered really safe. So if you could start with 10 really common safe herbs. Do you want me to give you a list of what those 10 might be really quickly? So, okay, just off the top of my head, or I can look at my notes and tell you. That might be helpful. This list has about 20 on them, but I would say chamomile would be a great one, because chamomile is a powerful anti-inflammatory. It's rich in azulene, which is a dark blue, like the color of Frankie's scarf. It's rich with a dark blue oil that's embedded inside that yellow flower. You don't see it, but it's there. And that azulene is a very, very powerful anti-inflammatory. But also just as a tea, it's relaxing. It's considered a nervine. It helps us to feel calm. And when you feel calm, you can actually have more energy and be more energetic. So chamomile nettle, because nettle is good for the reproductive system of men and women. It's good as a decongester for the liver. It's a really high source of iron and an incredibly rich source of calcium. That's why it has to protect itself with prickles, because it's such an edibly great plant. So it had to devise some system so not everybody was devouring it all the time. At least that's my theory. That formic acid also, by the way, that's rich in nettle, is also a high in bee stings, and in ants also have it. And it's used for any kind of inflammation like arthritis and bursitis. An old-fashioned treatment. We don't use this much anymore, but it does work. If you take a nettle wand or a nettle, and you kind of go, you have arthritis, and the doctor would be going like this. You can see why some of the herbal practices fell out of disuse. And then valerian is a powerful herb, a very strong nervine, especially for muscles and ligaments. So if people have a lot of tension, if you walk around like holding the world up with your shoulders, that'll drop them down. It's also really good for insomnia. It has no side effects. It's not addictive. It does not work for everybody. There's a percentage of the population, I actually think it's up to 15, 20%, who have an adverse reaction. Instead of it relaxing and calming them, you're one of those people, makes you feel very agitated. So sometimes there is that adverse reaction. It's because of one of the acids that's in the valerian, one of the chemical constituents, and if it's not converted in your system, then it can be agitating for you. But valerian, echinacea, absolutely. Any way that you can get echinacea, either as tea. I want to show you how to make a quick tincture here so you can go home and make your own tincture. Echinacea is the great herbal diplomat. It's native to the North American continent. When we were all sleeping through the 70s and the 80s and not using it, vast amounts of it were being taken out of our national parks, out of our prairie lands, and shipped to European markets. Thousands and thousands of tonnage every year, actually, so that today our native resources are depleted. And it's a huge problem in national parks and the prairie lands. So you can grow your own echinacea really easily. It's beautiful, it's strong here, it grows really well, and after 3 years you can dig it up and you can make great medicine from it. How many of you used echinacea for your immune system? Oh, great bunches of you. That's so good. There's been a flu and a cold going around, and a lot of people get it in their throat, a little tickle. So my husband had it for a couple weeks when I was gone visiting my mom. And when I came home, I got that same little tickle in my throat. I thought, oh, I can't do a talk and be sick. So anyway, so I just kept taking echinacea, and it works like magic, actually. But, on the back of the bottles, when you buy echinacea tincture, they, take 30 drops. I don't know whoever in the world can measure 30 drops, unless you're a Virgo. Everybody else is like about 10 drops, and then it's like Virgos love it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So anyway, it doesn't really work that way. You have to I take a shot glass of it, yeah, which is why I make my own. And I make a half a gallon of it, like you grow it, you just chop it up after the 3rd year. And if you don't grow it, you just buy it from one of our marvelous organic growers. Vermont is a herbally rich state now. It's really exciting to see. So echinacea, and then also I would say the dandelion, absolutely, as a bitter, and for the liver, for decongesting the liver, moving things through your body, and the leaf is wonderful for the kidneys. So yeah, just all these great herbs. And burdock, golden seal, absolutely. Lemon balm, that beautiful, delicious, sweet plant that can take over your garden. Most people don't recognize that's one of our most powerful antivirals. Heaven forbid, if you ever got like a herpes virus or a cold sore, herpes are really hard to get rid of, or shingles. And if you were in the United States and you had shingles and a herpes and you didn't know a local herbalist, you'll go to your doctor, and basically they have, my husband's giving me the signal, thank you. Basically they would give you a medicine that's not real effective, it hardly ever works, might go away for a little while, always comes back. If you were anywhere in Europe, any of the European countries, Western European countries, and you went to a doctor and you had herpes, they'd give you a lemon balm cream and lemon balm internally, and it would go away. And if you use that lemon balm oftentimes, it would not come back generally, because lemon balm is a very powerful antiviral. It's really one of the most effective things for any kind of viral infection, but definitely shingles. I usually combined it with licorice. Anyway, so that's just a little, and garlic is another one, and ginger. So I'm just throwing these out because I wanted you to know. If you want a little guidance, I wrote this book. I always hate to give examples of my own books because it sounds like I'm publicizing, but this is a great book for beginners. It's written for those people who are interested and want to make herbs, bring them back into your house. So it goes over the basic herbs and the safety issues and all those kinds of things. So, so you want to start with a small group of herbs, and you get to know those. That's how you work with plants. You grow them in your garden, you bring them in, you make tea with them, you try them for different things. You just start out this year, and you start to say, this works, this doesn't work, this tastes really good, this tastes bad. But you want to remember, good and bad tasting should not be qualifications for how herbalists are working in your body. So herbalists use herbs. We use herbs in many, many different ways, but probably one of the most popular ways are tinctures. For you to try. This is an herbal bitter that's actually made by a Vermont company that's being targeted right now by the FDA, because the FDA is coming down really heavily on small herbal businesses, trying to drive small, like the herbal businesses that are small. So we're having a big problem with that. But if you'd like to try, this is a nice herbal bitter. That bitters have been used for thousands of years by people for digestion. So we've forgotten the use of bitters here, and we have more digestive problems in America than you find in any other country. It's because we eat way too much sweets. So if you want to try a little bitter, you can do it like this, so that way we don't pass germs around. You can just put a little drop and taste it. It's really nice and bitter, so if you don't like bitters, you should definitely try it. It's called re-educating your taste buds. So, so herbalists use liquids like this, the tinctures they're called, and why we use them is they're concentrated medicine, very easy to make. I'm going to show you in a minute. And they go rapidly into your bloodstream, and they're really, really especially good for acute situations, like a flu coming on, a cold coming on, a headache coming on. They're pre-prepared, so you don't really have to do anything, though if you're not used to using herbal medicine, then you should always dilute it in water. It's a good idea because it will shock your taste buds. You'll go, oh my God, they're poisoning me with this nasty stuff. But herbalists pride themselves on just taking bitters and all these, things, like it's kind of part of the education of it. But always when I'm recommending herbs for other people, my family members, even my husband, I always like to put it in a little water for them to keep it less than strong. So how do you make an herbal tincture? Herbalism was called the art of simpling long before it was called herbalism. Simpling means common sense and simple. It was the people's medicine. It still is the people's medicine. So making tinctures that are really strong and good is quite simple. I'm going to take some echinacea here. This is grown by my daughter and my son-in-law. They're organic herb farmers in Vermont, very successful farmers, I would mention. My daughter was principal for a number of years at the Stowe Middle School, but at her heart, she was really a farmer. And so as soon as they could get that farm going and without her income, she quit her principal job and is farming full time. I'm quite proud of them. They have a book coming out on organic herb farming. So this is called total echinacea. It's the root, the leaf, and the flower. And it's dried. You can use it fried or dressed. Fried or dressed. Dressed or fried, or any way you want. And so you just take a jar. Now, for those of you who've never done this before, it's probably good to read the instructions, but I would suggest it, just like anything. Like when I'm trying to learn something new, make a candle or something, knit a sweater, I'm going to look at the instructions. But anyway, might as well use all that I have. So you put your herb in a jar, and then you cover it with 2 to 3 inches, so it's covered completely. A lot of times at home I put a little mark, take a marker and put a mark there, a little piece of tape or a little felt pen. And then I'm going to cover this by 2 to 3 inches of alcohol or vinegar. Vinegar is not as strong, but if you're opposed to using alcohol, vinegar works. So let's just do it. I'm going to use a little brandy here. Brandy was used a lot in medicines because it was relaxing. So we're going to cover our herbs by about 2 to 3 inches. And it looks like this herbs will settle down after they have to soak up. If it settles down and I don't have 2 to 3 inches of herb over it, alcohol, add a little bit more. Isn't this hard to do? Put some herb in a jar, pour some alcohol in, and then I put a lid on. And then the hardest part is labeling this. You should label this so you know what's in there and the alcohol and the date. That's pretty important. So if you can remember to do that, you're really good. The other thing is just put this on your kitchen counter where you're going to see it every day. And every day you shake it. This is really fun. But you want to shake it because, first of all, it macerates it and moves it. But this is also part of the medicine magic. So you shake it, and you say your prayers for blessings for the plants and the healing energy. Because we all know that energy works really well. We all know that. So this is the way medicine was always made, by the way. Medicine was always made. Are you giving me the time? Yeah, I got... Yeah, you can use vinegar if you're opposed to using alcohol.
Can you go to a state liquor store and get pure grain alcohol?
You can. In Vermont, you can do it. You just have to sign a paper that says you're an herbalist. That's all you do. You just go to the alcohol, you say you're an herbalist, and then you walk out with 15 bottles of pure grain alcohol.
Do you use that on your tinctures?
I've run large and small businesses, and when I do businesses where I'm selling the product, then I would use pure grain alcohol and dilute it. You always have to dilute it, but I have more control over the amount of water. But in truth, almost all plants break down in a brandy, vodka, or rum because they have an 80 proof has 40% alcohol, 60% water. 100 proof, not pure grain, but 100 proof, like say a vodka, has 50% alcohol, 50% water. This shouldn't mean anything. I don't want to get the rest of you confused here, but that's a perfect medium for breaking down almost all plant constituents. If you have a plant that has a high resin in it, like say chaparral, then you'll need more alcohol. And that's why most companies will use the pure grain because you can control the amount of water to alcohol in that. But for home purposes, like for instance, when I would have my little labs and I would make my products and I was measuring everything, I would go home when I'd make my own tinctures. This is how I would make them because it makes just as good a medicine without the fuss. So it's the way I recommend it, that you do it. Vodka, brandy. Yeah. So, yeah. Great. Yeah. So, and some people don't like to use alcohol for religious purposes or because it's an issue for them. So you can always use vinegar, but vinegar isn't as strong. So so let's get back to our tincture. We're almost done. We shake it every day for 5 or 6 years. No. So for about usually 4 weeks. I think 4 to 6 weeks is a good time. And at the end of that time, you just strain off the liquid. You compost that leftover, what's called the marc or the herb, and then you rebottle that tincture. And that tincture will last indefinitely. Usually we store it in a cool place, like in a pantry, in a closet. It will last indefinitely. I just want to share that with you because this medicine is simple and easy and safe, inexpensive. It costs nothing more than a bottle of brandy. Well, that can be a little expensive. So I wanted to pass this around. This is called fire cider. Robert has a bunch of these postcards out there that has this recipe on it. We're doing a little campaign that's called Free Fire Cider, a tradition, yeah, a little one. We've been fighting this madly. We even have lawyers about it. So this is what we call a traditional formula. It's a formula that belonged to the people and has been made by hundreds, if not thousands of people. It's an old recipe that was developed at the California School of Herbal Studies in the 1980s for people, for everybody to use, and some young upstart company trademarked the name and won't take the trademark off, and we're a little furious about that. So we're trying to get the trademark taken off because we don't want to see our traditional products trademarked. It's one thing if it's yours and you've developed it and you've put a lot of energy into it, but it's another when it's, you know, one of the old recipes. So you can get the recipe. This is a fabulous recipe for winter. This is one of my secrets for keeping healthy in the winter. Fire cider is made with, oh my God, horseradish, garlic, onion, and ginger. And if you want a lemon in there, yeah, I know, it's deadly. And cayenne. Oh. Yeah, and you chop all that up and you grate it up and you put it in a jar. It's basically a tincture. You cover all those ingredients with apple cider vinegar, raw and filtered preferably. You let it sit for 4 weeks and then you strain it. And then you have this hot, fiery, pungent, whoo, kick-ass medicine. And then we add honey to taste. So this doesn't have a lot of honey in it. If you'd like to try it, it's, you know, it's hot and fiery, so it's a little bit of a yay. It'll get you going here. If you want to take one of these little tiny cups, I wasn't expecting such a big crowd, so if you just take a tiny little bit in there, and that's probably all you're going to want, but I just, you know, I guzzle this again, a big shot glass of it, start to feel my throat happening, so you can take a little cup. Frankie, that would be good for you.
Oh, okay.
That's exactly what you need in your throat. So, that you can get that recipe. It's easy to make. It's a really good. And by the way, just to say this word for our great Dr. Jarvis. Dr. Jarvis was a Vermont doctor. He was a medical doctor, a beloved doctor who lived in Barrie, Vermont. And he wrote a very famous book. You know, he's extremely well known around the world and the rest of the United Nations, the United States, but he's very little known in Vermont, which is very sad. I think they should have a museum for him. And in fact, his house in Barrie is for sale, and I want somebody to buy it and make it into a museum for Dr. Jarvis. So if any of you have a few extra dollars, it's, I think, $275,000 for this beautiful old Dr. Jarvis house in Barrie. And it would be such a huge thing for the medical world and the herbalists and everything. Anyway, his big thing was folk medicine, because he saw in his medical practice, he learned from a lot of the old people that came in, and then he started practicing that medicine, and his favorite medicine was apple cider vinegar, maple syrup, and cayenne. Yeah, right. So his book is wonderful to read today. So this is Dr. Jarvis would really approve of this. And then a couple other medicines. There's another little thing I'll pass around after you have that hot one, is the elderberry. So do you all know your elderberry? Elderberry is a beautiful, beautiful shrubby, weedy plant that grows throughout Vermont, actually throughout the whole United States. And again, in Europe, this is the primary medicine of anything sold for flu prevention, because it has broad spectrum antiviral properties. It's smart. It's going to recognize lots and lots of different flu bugs because it's been evolving on this planet for longer than we have. And it's been used by people for thousands of years. So this is a really nice, you know, I usually make up a couple bottles of this stuff. And it's just elderberries and honey, cooked down into a nice syrup, and I put a little tiny bit of brandy, not very much, just to preserve it, like just a very small amount. You won't even taste it in there. So I'm going to pass my elderberry syrup around. I think I might have a little taste of it before it goes. Does somebody have a little? Oh, they have a cup here. I think I'll have a tiny cup. Boy, I was being cheap. I just wanted to make sure there's enough. I'd like to take a bunch of this, but anyway, it's so nice tasting. So you can add this to fizzy water.
A little boiling water.
A little boiling water. It's so good. I like this kind of medicine, you know, that you make an hour to cook it up. I know it's inexpensive. I can gather my own elderberries. I know everything and it's ecological and safe. I know that the only side effect is going to be a good effect. You know, it's all of those good things, and it tastes so good. Not very many herbal medicines taste this good.
Can you get accustomed to the powers of these things and then they have a reduced effect, or do they maintain their function?
Well, about it, so the question is, can you get immune to these things? It's, you know, like not immune, but can you get tolerant? So most of this stuff, like a lot of what we're talking about, we're using when you have problems that might be a week or two. So, and when you have a flu or a cold, the symptoms change all the time. So you're changing your medicines as you're going. So your body doesn't really build up an immunity to it necessarily, but I always feel it's good to change your medicines, you know, like every few days. Like if you have a cold, I might take something, like I take a lot of echinacea when I want to ward something off. Once I have it, I'm going to use something different than echinacea. But yeah, that's a little bit of a challenging, because I think that it kind of depends on, it's not like you get it's not really like your body builds up an immunity to it, but the illness itself changes, and so you have to use different remedies for it. Then this is another thing that herbalists have been making for literally centuries. This is made with St. John's wort. So this is the famous St. John's wort oil. It's one of the very first things I have students do in the summertime is, you know, I say if you can go home and make a St. John's wort oil, you'll be really doing yourself and your children and your families a great favor. So people have been making St. John's wort oil for hundreds of years. You just gather the fresh St. John's wort flowers when they're fresh. You put them in olive oil, you cover them with the olive oil, you let them sit for 2 weeks. Those bright yellow flowers turn your olive oil blood red. And this is a fabulous herb for any kind of nerve damage and trauma and burns. And then the tincture of St. John's wort is actually used, it's really, really good for the long winters in Vermont. So if you know, around March and April, you start to get a little depressed because there's not been sunshine and you want to get out in your gardens and you just feel a little down, St. John's wort oil helps keep that sparkle. It keeps that little yellow light going in you. So, yeah, the tincture I usually make, or the teas. And that's the other way, is the wonderful teas. I'm a huge advocate for teas and drinking teas. So I could go on, as you can tell, forever talking about plants, forever and ever and ever. But it's late and everybody is giving me the signals. My husband's starting to growl at me out there. So I think I should stop. I want to thank you so much for coming out. If you do have questions, I don't know, do we have 10 minutes for questions? So we can do that. And if any, yes. Yeah, so golden seal is one of our great contributions to world medicine. It's the #1 herb that's shipped in massive amounts out of this country, which is extremely unfortunate because it's grown nowhere else in the world except for the North American continent. Grows only in the east coast of the North American continent, throughout the whole, our whole eastern seaboard and up into a little bit of Canada. It's been one of our most treasured medicines. It's very rich in plant alkaloids, the hydrastine and berberine in particular, which fight infections. It's a marvelous remedy for infections, for any infection that rests on the mucous membrane. So for instance, conjunctivitis or vaginal infections. So you have that same membranes on your eyes, well, it's not exactly the same, but it's that it's a little different between your eyes and your vagina, but anyway, it's that mucous membranes, and that golden seal is very excellent for that. It is a strong medicine, and so echinacea is one of those plants that's rich in alkaloids, so we have to use it respectfully and carefully, but we also have to remember that our woodlands have been severely over-harvested. In fact, it used to grow in Vermont. We're up in the northern range of it, but it used to be found here. You hardly ever find it growing wild. It's estimated that around 60 million roots, 60 million, this is done on tonnage report from APA, American Herbal Product Association, about 60 million roots annually were dug from the northeastern hardwood forest, most of that being shipped to European markets, not for herbal markets, but for the pharmaceutical companies. So it's a great herb, and it grows beautifully. You can grow it beautifully in your gardens, so long as you mimic the growing conditions of it. So it grows in eastern hardwood forests, so you just have to kind of mimic it. There's some very good books, and I would encourage all of you, if you love plants, love your plants, not necessarily if you're medicinal plants, that you consider joining United Plant Savers, which is a wonderful organization that's national, that is now 20 years old. It started here in Vermont. It's become a national organization. It is the primary voice, the only voice for medicinal plant conservation in the United States. We were able to get golden seal put on the CITES list, the International Trade for Endangered Species, plants and flowers, plants and animals, actually. We worked with the Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. government to be able to put it on the CITES list, which prevents it being shipped from this country in whole form, but still allows it to be shipped, unfortunately, in prepared form. But it's something. Yes? Did you have a question, or are you just stretching?
Do you know where you can dig for Vermont ginseng?
Well, first of all, I would, I'm not the person to ask that because it's a controversial question. You know, ginseng hunting is a tradition in all of the Northeast and the Southeast, and there are excellent people who go out, wildcrafters who hunted, and they are very responsible for how they put the seeds, and they say they're advocates for restoration. But I would want to say this, that we have so little ginseng left in our woods that there is no, this is a very personal opinion if you don't mind, but I'm speaking so I get to be as opinionated as I want. I don't think there is such a thing as responsible harvesting of native woodland ginseng anymore. Since the 1700s, American ginseng has been dug out of the wild and shipped to Asian markets. And again, large amounts. North American ginseng, it's called Panax quinquefolium, grows nowhere else in the world, and it is the most highly valued ginseng, or among the most highly valued ginsengs in the world. So where ginseng used to grow, not ever commonly, but where people would find it, it's very rare in the woodlands. So rather than harvest it, I suggest that you plant it. Plant it for future generations of plant lovers, and also plant it for the future of our woodlands, because this is something that we don't think about very much when we think of plant conservation. But these plant communities have evolved together for literally thousands of years. They have their own integral community. And when you take the old shamans out of the forest, you leave an environment. It'd be like taking all of the healers, doctors, nurses, herbalists, massage therapists, psychotherapists. You take them out of the community will collapse because these are part of what holds it up. And so we've done that to our woodlands, not even thinking about it. So we don't want to take these rare plants, we want to put them back. And how we can use American ginseng is we support the farmers that are growing it. It's called wood simulated. People who go into the woodlands and they make a little patch and they plant the ginseng because they're going to go back in 8 or 10 years and they're going to harvest it. That's their crop. But I would say leave our wild ginseng alone. So you'll hear different opinions about that. I respect the wildcrafters tremendously in the art of wildcrafting, but with our rare, so United Plant Savers has identified 22 medicinal plants that we consider at risk and another about 30 that we consider to watch. And ginseng and golden seal are absolutely on the at-risk list. That's been adopted by the Fish and Wildlife as a definitive list. Yes?
I was interested in your comments about the illegality of herbalism at the beginning. I think, properly speaking, what's illegal is to diagnose and prescribe without a license, and also to prescribe and then sell what you prescribe. I believe that's what's...
When I worked in my herb store, technically you're right, but when I worked in my herb store, if somebody came in and they said, I have a bad cold, and I say, I have some herbs that will help you, that's actually illegal. And if I sold an herb, which I did, if I have an herb and then I have a book even too close to it or anything that states that this would be good for something, that's illegal. So for instance, this particular, which I have no, this was a company I started back in the 70s, so I'm not using this as an example in anything other than this. This was the first herb company to get an over-the-counter license, so they could make statements on here. They're called OTC, so they could make claims like, that this would help for your sore throat or whatever. But as an herbalist doing that in my store, at any time I could have been chastised. It doesn't happen very much. And that part also about recommending herbs and then selling them to them, I always think that that's kind of a strange, it's an interesting policy because we don't like it when the medical profession does that. It just seems wrong, It's illegal, and for very good reasons. But it goes further than that, for not just for herbalists, but anybody that doesn't fall in that license. And also the other thing is it doesn't matter now, like they have schools where you can get certified. So you can get certified as an herbalist, but it's still not legal to practice. But the government hasn't come down hard. Where they're coming down hard right now, it just happened. They passed this law, I think it's about 4 years old now or 5, called GMPs, the Good Medicine Practice Laws. principle, they're really good, right? They're really good. It's about being able to track every single herb that you use in your product and being able to show exactly where it was grown and what lot number it is. So it's very good. It was designed for large companies that were selling. It actually came about because of the weight loss issues. Remember, they were selling a lot of very unethical products for people to lose weight and making claims. So the FDA stepped in to regulate that. But what they're really doing now is regulating, like the person who's selling herbs at the local market. You know, it's gotten to be, it's going to drive all of the small herbalists and people who are making these medicines out of business. Some people might think that's good, but this is the way herbalism has been practiced for centuries. And as I said, like, I think it's really a people's choice. I think it's up to us. It's not the government that should tell us whether or not I can buy an herb at the local market or not. I feel like I should be able to, thank you. But, you know, that's all different opinions. I'm not really asking, you know, I'm just sharing with you my thoughts on it all, which I'm apt to admit I'm really out there with it.
If I could just follow up on that, I'm an advocate for requiring a license for people who diagnose and for people who prescribe. I think that's a good thing. And I hope.
Thank you. You know, I think that is, you know, one of the organizations that I kind of following and I like is it's an organization called the Health Freedom Organization, National Health Freedom Coalition. And actually it was formed, it's about 10 years old now. It was formed in Minnesota when a farmer was arrested for giving his neighbors colostrum from the cows for health properties. I don't know if sometimes colostrum is used. And he was arrested because he was telling his neighbors that this was good for stuff. So this is just a local farmer, a small farmer, and it became national. There was a couple lawyers who decided to represent him for free, and they won the case. And then they decided to create like what's called a safe harbor exemption laws, which would allow. So this is actually probably something you wouldn't approve of, but I just wanted to share it. And so, but what it does is it says that so long as you practice within the realms of your profession. So as an herbalist, I'm not trained to diagnose, nor use medical terms, nor use medical tools. As an herbalist, I'm trained to use plants, you know, for healing purposes. But definitely I don't diagnose and stuff, you know. I mean, so, and the laws are set, the Health Freedom Coalition is helping state by state laws set up health freedom exemption laws that allow people to have choices of who they want to go see, and also to provide safety within that. It might be something that just look at, you know, I would recommend that if any of you are interested in health freedom and a possible good model for that, you would go on the National Health Freedom Coalition website and just look at it. And to me, it's the most sound model that's offered, because they are saying that, you know, if you're a massage practitioner, you can't practice like a doctor. If you're a herbalist, you can't practice like a doctor. You have to practice within the realm. You have to make a clear statement of what you say and do. You know, and so they're providing some very, very good guidelines, because obviously we don't want it to turn back to what was going on in the early 1800s when anybody could just say, I'm a whatever and do anything. There needs to be some practical guidelines. But the fact that it's evolved into what it is today, I'm not sure that that is a good model. Actually, I don't think it serves the American public very well at all, quite frankly. And I think it's brought us to the problems that we have with the healthcare system today. So it's a good subject to think about. Thank you for your comments, by the way, I appreciate it.
This is just a little point. In 1995, I went to Mongolia and studied traditional Mongolian medicine and learned a lot about herbs and all other treatments. And when I came back, and I'm a nurse, and when I came back, I wrote the Board of Nursing and said, this is what I've learned, what can I practice? And they basically said I could practice any of it as a nurse, and that I could use the herbs as long as they were over-the-counter herbs.
Yeah, that's really good.
Most they've changed it since then,
well, most nurses don't find that true, actually, because herbalism is not what you're trained in nursing school. So, I mean, that's beautiful that they said that. But usually, most nurses aren't allowed to use herbs, and you know,
because I wrote to them, to the board, of
yeah,
State Board of Nursing
in Vermont,
and said,
That was, you got somebody who was very excellent, because that really isn't normally what happens, but that's wonderful. You got somebody who's probably trained to be an herbalist. So anyway, we'll take one more, maybe two more questions, and I'm going to let you go because you have a long night. But yeah, so she was saying, I was mentioning chamomile, and is there a difference between the German and Roman? There is chemical differences, but I would say overall they both work very similar. They're both nervines. They both have anti-inflammatory properties. People have different favorites, which ones they use, you know. So I don't really find. Julie, do you find a difference, a big difference? Yeah. Julie is another great practicing herbalist in Vermont. So, yes.
You hear that there are people who practice, and there's a whole array of Chinese herbs and Tibetan herbal treatments and
yes.
other countries as well. How are those herbs indigenous to those cultures and for the issues of peoples there, or because there are practitioners of Chinese herbal medicine here, how does one decide which route to go, because there are whole different models of healing?
Yes. Well, that's one of the most beautiful things about American herbalism, is that it's very eclectic. It's one of the things I love the most about our Western tradition. It actually is eclectic in the sense that it's using Ayurvedic and Chinese and sometimes from Africa, and, you know, like Sass is training with the Mongolian healers, you know, so there's a lot of integration. It's not like if you were trained as a traditional Chinese herbalist, you are trained in one way with a set group of herbs. And there's many different systems. It's just like we're talking about healing. There's many different ways that we can use to keep ourselves healthy, and many different systems. So it's the same in herbalism. And people are drawn to these different systems. It's not necessarily one's better than the other. Like what I usually find is each one brings something very special to the table. And people are drawn to different systems of healing. So, yeah, I mean, so what to say about him? There's always there's a lot of overlap and then very distinct differences. One of the issues, and this is, there are some American practitioners that are working with the system of Chinese herbalism or the system of Ayurvedic and starting to use Western herbs for that, because one of the problems when you study a tradition from another country, you're dependent often on the herbs that are imported from China, which we have no quality control over, very little. We don't really know how they're grown. We don't really know the environmental or ecological impact of that. We have much, so this is another thing about American herbalism that is a world model, is when we started practicing herbalism, quality was an issue that was brought up very early, like in the 1980s and 1990s. So we have an incredible herbal market here for organic herbs, and we have much more so than in any place else you travel in the world. And we provide a world model not only for conservation, but organically cultivated plants. So all the plants that are grown in China are not grown in ways that would meet our specifications. In India, it's pretty much the same. There are some organic standards now in India. I don't know about in China. So that is a little bit of an issue, but nonetheless, those are things that people are figuring out and working out now. As I said, there's a lot of practitioners of Chinese medicine who are going, well, what plants are the Western counterparts? And they're looking at it very deeply, recognizing that a plant may change if it's grown in the North American continent versus growing in Asia. So there's a lot of depth in that. And also another thing is that Chinese herbalism through acupuncture was legalized in this country. So people can be a practitioner of acupuncture using Chinese herbs, and you can get a license for that. Isn't that interesting? You can get a license for being a practitioner of Chinese medicine, but you can't get one for being one for Western medicine. And just to let you know, we have some very rigorous schools for Western herbology. There's 4-year schools. There's the Vermont Center for Integrative Herbalism, which is a 3-year school. And so we have some very, very good schools. It's not like people aren't getting the training. And it's not like they're not going out there and working with doctors and nurses and, you know, doing in their neighborhoods and their communities, helping out. It's just that, you know, that we're always working a little bit with one foot outside the law, which I think gives you a lot of freedom, by the way. A lot of things that are super regulated, you are, you know, I'm a bit of a renegade, what can I say? I've always liked working. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Well,